Friends, I welcome you to this part of our afternoon. As many of you know, our presbytery has chosen to become a Matthew 25 mid-council, and many of our congregations are also accepting the invitation to be a Matthew 25 congregation. This year, we have been emphasizing the importance of one of the emphases of Matthew 25, which is to dismantle structural racism. We invited the Reverend Diane Moffat to be with us from the Presbyterian Mission Agency at our August Presbytery meeting to share with us the work of dismantling structural racism within the context of Matthew 25. Today, we have invited Fran Lane Lawrence from Lake Michigan Presbytery and Ryan Landino from Great Rivers Presbytery, both here in the Midwest, and have asked them to help lead a conversation. Both Fran and Ryan are members of the General Assembly Special Committee on Racism, Truth, and Reconciliation, and they will share with us some of their experiences on that committee as well as some of their learnings. But they also very much want to engage you here in the presbytery as members of congregations, as part of a presbytery here in the Midwest, about your experiences in racism and the efforts to dismantle structural racism. And they will be taking any questions, any comments throughout the afternoon, and responding to them and inviting us to respond to one another. We also have a design team in our presbytery that has been working on various elements of dismantling structural racism, and they will be doing some follow-up conversations, and there will be more about that in the days after the presbytery meeting. But we hope this afternoon will be a rich opportunity for you to engage with two of our colleagues in the Presbyterian Church USA. I'd like to open with prayer, and then at that time, I will turn the time over to Fran and Ryan so that they can begin the conversation with us. Will you pray with me? Loving and gracious God, on this afternoon, when we are so aware of how people interact with one another and how important it is to look ahead and to plan for a life together as both a country and as a denomination, we are very aware that part of the work that you call us to is the work of dismantling structural racism. That until we can begin to do that as individuals, as congregations, as a mid-council, as a denomination, that we are not truly honoring one another as sisters and brothers in Christ. So we ask that you would bless this time so that we might listen and learn, but that we might also speak from our hearts with honest questions, with frank comments, so that Fran and Ryan's time might be as beneficial for them as they serve on the committee as it is to us as we live in this presbytery. Heavenly Father, we ask now that you would be with us and with all who hear this message today. In the name of Jesus, and let all of God's people say, Amen.
Hello, friends and good people of Whitewater Valley Presbytery. It's good to see you. My name is Ryan Landino. I serve on the Special Committee on Racism, Truth, and Reconciliation. I do see some familiar faces here. Hello, hello. And I do want to say, as I introduce myself as the leader of Great Rivers Presbytery, I also want to give a special shout out of appreciation to Christy Quinn for her 11 years of service as the administrative assistant of Great Rivers Presbytery before she made the move to bless your presbytery. So I'm grateful for her ministry as well, and grateful for the connections that we share. So yes, I serve on this committee. I started in ministry as the English minister of a Taiwanese American community church, which was my first bit of exposure into multicultural, intercultural ministry. And then I was ordained as a pastor of a Slovak immigrant church. So I've had experience from with multicultural ministry that has experienced government oppression and communism in a very real kind of way, both from Chinese communist systems and Russian communist systems. And that's kind of began a little bit of my journey of kind of seeing how these types of functions around the way we see and policies affect and linger on in generations, and how it affects today. So I made the move out to be the pastor of a small church in Geneseo, Illinois, in my current presbytery. And I was so struck by how homogeneously all white the community was. And I'm going to admit it kind of freaked me out a little bit because I never served in a context like that before. So that got me connected back into the anti-racism community that I just took for granted in my call in New Jersey. And then I got more and more connected, more involved. My paths kept crossing with Fran and with other wonderful people who now serve on national conversations around racism in the Peace USA. And then I became the lead presbyter of Great Rivers Presbytery, where I've been serving for 2 years. So it's my honor to join you here today. Fran, who are you?
Some days I don't know. I'm Fran Lane Lawrence, and I am the transitional co-leader and stated clerk for Presbytery of Lake, Michigan. And I began doing work in anti-racism about 20 years ago or so. I was, and then one of the watershed moments was when I became the executive director of a faith-based community center. It was connected to the Presbyterian Church, but an ecumenical endeavor in Wheeling, West Virginia, called Lackland Chapel. At the chapel and in West Virginia, only 3% of the population of West Virginia, the whole state, is Black. But there in the chapel, in this place, this community center where I served, we would feed about 200 kids a night, and about 98% of those kids were Black or biracial, children of color, and 98% of them were also lived under the poverty line, so they were very at risk. And through my experience with them and their experiences, watching their experiences with the school system, with the police, with folks in the neighborhood, with churches who would come in to be part of the programming of the chapel, I came to see very clearly the dynamics of racism and how profoundly that it was affecting them. So that's some of my background. And so been working in the Presbyterian Church and continue to do some anti-racism work, and met some folks. I see lots of friends around the our little screens here. So hi folks. So I got to know Ryan and some other wonderful folks, and was appointed to serve on the special committee for racism, truth, and reconciliation. And so that's how I got to this place. And so I'm going to stop and see if Ryan wants to add anything before I move on to the committee.
Yeah, thanks. So these conversations I find to be very life-giving and very energizing, because underneath the hardship, there's also hope. So I just want to preface just a little bit with just a couple of just comments as we dive in. I just want to name, and this probably was named during your earlier morning session, but there is an election going on, which I'm going to confess and admit that it does, if you will, color the conversation quite a bit. And I know I'm carrying it in my heart right now. I know I'm carrying it in my mind and in my body. And so I just want to name that that's in this space as well. And so just to acknowledge that that's here, and that there are both kind of short-term and long-term parts and aspects of this conversation. And I want to give us permission to be able to name that both in ourselves and in this conversation. So some of this, I don't want to assume that it's going to make everybody uncomfortable. It might be really inspiring for each of us. I just want to acknowledge and give us permission to be however it is that you are. So in particular, I just want to name, because this is one of my bigger things, to just be really aware of your bodies. If you're feeling tension, where are you feeling that? Mind yourself to give yourself permission to breathe as you feel needed. If you need to block out the screen for just a little bit, that's okay. Please feel free to do that. But just know I'm one of those preachers who loves to see faces. So personally, I'd love to see your faces, but I'm also aware you're a part of a long meeting today. So whatever it is you need to do to regulate your screen fatigue and be most present in this space to take care of yourself, please, please do that. I will be using the chat feature to kind of throw up here some links for you. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to raise them, and then we'll see them eventually and we'll kind of get to them. And also, if we mention a term or a phrase or say something that don't quite understand what that is, feel free to ask, and along the way, we'll try to make sure that we have time to address that, to make sure that we're all on the same page. But this conversation is a blessing, and I'm blessed to be here with you. So thanks. Okay, Fran, go ahead.
So I want to start by telling you a little bit about the committee and the dynamics on the committee. So the special committee was supposed to be a commission in 2016, I believe, and it had some very specific criteria for who could be on and the makeup of that commission. And because those requirements were so stringent, the moderators were not able to fill that commission. So in 2018, the committee who met changed that from a commission to a committee, which means it changed the dynamics of our work just a little bit, and changed the criteria for who could serve on that committee. So on that committee right now, you have 14 people. 5 of those people are white. Ryan is the only white male. And the rest of us identify, the rest of the white folks there identify as female. And then the rest of the makeup of the committee are people of color. And I can't remember right off the top of my head who everyone is. But we're very conscious as we do our work as white people on that committee to do it with accountability to the people of color who know the dynamics of their life, who encounter racism. It is the water that they've lived in, and the same as we live in what I call a white supremacist culture. And so we're all mixed up in that. Our moderators are Byron Wade. A lot of you might know Byron, and Marta Pomeroy. And we really work to keep up with them. They are very dynamic. And our staff resource people, one of them is Denise Anderson, and I wrote it down so I get her title right. She's the coordinator for racial and intercultural justice for the PMA. And then Valerie Azumi also resources us. So that's a whole ball of wax of who is on and how we are. I want to talk about a little bit about our work. So we are called to listen to the voices long silenced in the church. And as the committee started meeting, it became apparent very early that some of us on the committee, the white folks on the committee, maybe didn't understand dynamics of racism as clearly as we should. And so we had some folks from Crossroads come in. Jessica came in and gave us some training, and we started to develop some understanding. We started to develop a relationship between us. We started to trust one another and started to have deeper conversations and to become close. As we begin to do our work, the conversation shifted a little bit because the people of color on the committee were saying, well, our voices haven't been silenced always. The church just has not always listened to our voices. We never have been quiet. We have never been silenced. The church has not heard us. And so that's one of the understandings that we carry with us as we are doing our work. Another dynamic that we ran into, one of the things that we do is we began listening. And so we were very intentional about talking about what questions we were going to ask and who was going to ask them, and all the information that we needed, felt like we needed to get to fulfill our call and commission from the General Assembly. And so we started meeting with folks, and very quickly we discovered that as we would meet in groups, white people in the group were becoming voyeurs. So they were watching and listening to the pain of people of color as they described it all over again. And that was re-traumatizing the people who we were having conversation with. And so we learned very quickly that we needed to rethink the way we were listening. And so one of the things we decided as a committee is that we needed to be a little more proactive and more assertive in our listening, particularly as it in regards to meeting with white folks. And so we decided we would meet in different groups. So when we meet to do listening groups, there are people of color who meet, and there are white people. And again, we're always doing this, being accountable to the people of color. So we're debriefing with them. They're in the room with us sometimes. So we're very careful that we're not breaking off as white people into our own circles again. And as we're listening with white people, we are doing some teaching. So we start with a premise, and we're very clear about the premise we start with. We start with the premise that racism is a real thing, that it is a power dynamic, and it is people who use that power dynamic to oppress people of color. We also, our assumption is that we live in a white supremacist culture where everything is centered around whiteness and white people and their comfort. And so as we begin our listening, we're also teaching white people about situations of racism and the dynamics of racism. And we're calling out, as they're talking, we're calling out situations of misunderstanding around race. One of the poignant moments was when I was in the room with Marta and some other people of color who were leading the meeting, and they were leading a group of white folks, and we had decided who was doing what beforehand, and my role was the supporting role to just listening. And the white people in the room were saying some very racist things. And because it wasn't my role to step up and say anything, and because as white people, it is not our role to come in and save Black people. They don't need us to save them. I just was there and listening. And as we debriefed, we realized how traumatizing that was for the people of color. So we've shifted our way of working and listening to the people in the church, and trying to help people understand the dynamics of race and white supremacy, especially in the church. So that's where we're focused in our work, and we've become very close. We're a very close-knit group. We trust each other, and we mourn when our siblings of color are are in situations of oppression or racism and further harmed and oppressed. And it's very difficult for us to see. And I'm going to stop here and pop it over to Ryan because he might have something he wants to say about this.
Sure. Yeah. And I just want to reiterate and amplify and just build on some things that Fran lifted up, just because, I mean, they were so important. I remember at the very beginning of our work, just there was, I shouldn't have been surprised, but there was some cynicism around, okay, great, what are these folks going to be able to do? And you know, are they going to fight the whole time? You know, what's this going to be? But we really became a family. And we became a family really quickly, and it was really, really amazing. So we are here at the committee's blessing, knowing that we are held accountable for every step of the way, you know, of this. So I did want to share some of these takeaways are in our committee report, and I wanted to put that in the chat for you. I wouldn't recommend reading it, but I'd recommend saving the chat along the way because I'm going to be giving you a bunch of stuff, you know, as we kind of go on. But yeah, so just a couple of things I want to you know touch on as well was our approach really changed by necessity. Because the whole definition of what it means to listen was really challenged. Like I expected that we would just kind of just go in there and just go, yeah, just tell us about your story. But you know, when Fran encountered that situation of you know and just seeing some of these behaviors of white people interrupting people of color, or people saying, oh, I have a story like that too, and it having nothing to do with the heart that the person of color just poured out in the room, we found out that whatever it was wasn't working. And so we found what we were calling was black and white differences between the way that this conversation was being experienced. And this was one of our bigger takeaways and observations. And we saw this and learned this real quick. When we would have this conversation, when white people would find out about this conversation, there was this kind of voyeurism kind of thing. Like, it was almost like if people listened, they could hear the magic answer to healing racism, if they could just listen to a person of color. And there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, and white people lined up and they wanted to be a part of these sessions. And it was like, and there was also an attitude of, wow, this is so great that the PCUSA is finally talking about this. And then we have people of color, and specifically I want to reference black people in particular. I want to name black or BIPOC people. When we say BIPOC, that's the word that we use to reference black indigenous people of color, to include and mention indigenous and black people as well, not and with people of color. Their response was much more cynical and jaded, and it was you know, we heard like, I've done this. This is the third time I've been a part of this conversation. What are you we've been doing this for years. What are you gonna do that's different than hasn't been done before? So what an amazing disconnect between the white people's experience of our work and BIPOC people, black indigenous people of color. And what we learned was that the conversation needed to be very, very different, depending on whether we were engaging white people or engaging black people, which is very, very kind of almost countercultural to the way that we've understood this, because we taught ourselves that segregation is bad and we don't want to divide people. We want to make sure we get people together. But now we're hearing, wait a minute, we need a conversation for an intentional, separate space that goes alongside of the collaborative, cross-cultural, intercultural conversations as well. So what we found out was what we did begin to experiment with dividing that up, where we would have special sessions for white people, and then we would have another space for people of color to engage each other in that work. And the goals were vastly different. There was a healing kind of working through trauma thing going on with the people of color spaces. And then with white people, we found that we could not just sit back and listen, because, and this was another takeaway that we discovered, was it wasn't so much that we noticed in general that white people were uninformed about race, but we were seeing a mass misinformation about race. People saying things that were demonstrably incorrect, or that could be problematic, or led to some problematic tropes. Like we heard like white saviorism, we heard distancing from whiteness, we heard, you know, I have a black friend, I'm not racist, or I have an adopted black child, how can I be racist? I mean, some of these kinds of things, which were very hurtful to the conversation, and is what made people of color, black people and indigenous people, roll their eyes and want to leave the conversation. So So what we, and as Fran mentioned, we learn to be much more intentional and to name that. And when we do go in more in depth to these spaces, to make sure that we give people a heads up that we will interrupt some things if we find that's being hurtful. And we want to move to share responsibility, especially in all white spaces, to share responsibility for ownership of accountability in that particular space. So I did want to say, because Fran had mentioned this phrase called white supremacy culture a couple times, and I do want to name how important that is that we kind of understand what this is. Because one thing I hear a lot regularly is there's no racism here because we're all white. So I want to name just one. That's one of those misinformation, really problematic things that makes people of color have real little hope in our ability to navigate issues of race. So I want to share with you an article. This is one of the best, I think, articles that describes what we're talking about how a culture that is predominantly white folks have certain tendencies and certain norms that become the predominant attitudes of that space. And it's from this article from 2001 by Jones and Akun. And it basically lists a number of qualities of a white supremacist culture. We're talking about perfectionism. We're talking about a sense of adhering to the written word, a sense of, let's see, what else? There's only one right way of doing this, a top-down approach, either or thinking. And if you look at each of those lists, and please do this on your own time, it's a wonderful thing to study with your sessions. Ask yourself, take out the title and replace it to Presbyterian culture. And you will find it almost describes the Presbyterian church to a T. And that, we need to take notice of that. Before I move on with other takeaways, Fran, anything you want to jump in and add on to that?
Yeah, there was something that I thought, and then I lost it. So I wanted to talk about the time when we were at the Co-Inspire. So we were at the Co-Inspire conference in Montreat, which was a wonderful conference where, again, we were learning about, it was for white people to learn about the dynamic. Ryan, I'm going to give this to you for just a second.
Okay. Okay. No worries. Yeah, I have 3 coworkers right now who are sleeping on the job, and that's really great that they are, because they bark and they make a lot of noise too. Yeah, and the about, I do see a question in the comments that I'll just speak generally to about attitudes from Black people and people of color about this feeling of white people coming in to change them. I want to name some history around some of that. If you do look at white supremacy culture, that article, there is that type of paternalism, that type of having the best answer from the top, that we can convey the wisdom down to you, comes off as very delegitimizing and very often very dehumanizing. And when there's a history of that, of people coming into their space because we have a culture and a better way of doing things to give to you, it becomes a very kind of white savior-ish type of thing. So when every interaction you have with white people and white communities coming into your community is that, it can build up over time. So when partnerships are done, and I'm really impressed with the missionaries of the Peace USA. They've learned this, and I think we could learn a lot from them in the way that they've learned this. Especially the last, I don't know how long. Okay, I won't say how long, because the missionaries could speak to when they started to learn this. But they learned that they needed to do the work in partnership. They can't come into a space and just and bring all this amazing good stuff around their wisdom, and because people of color can see right through that. And it was basically the reports back in those spaces were you're just coming to bring your superior white ways to us. You don't know us. You haven't lived with us. You haven't walked our shoes. You don't know the policies, And so I remember when I did a lot of missions earlier in my discipleship. And I remember seeing these coldness patterns and knowing that we were on a lot of mission trips, quote unquote, that we didn't know who these people were. We just knew we were going to go and show them how to have a clean neighborhood. And only later did I realize how destructive and belittling that was. And later did I realize the value of of being in partnership and learning. There's a wonderful quotation that comes out of the Aboriginal Australian activist community. It's often attributed to one activist woman, but she doesn't want attribution because she wants the shared nature of the quote, because it came out of a shared process. It's something along the lines of, if you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. Rather, let us work together so that your liberation can be bound with mine. That statement, one, it's beautiful, but two, it's a direct accusation of the paternalism and white saviorism that comes with white supremacy culture. So these are the types of things that we aren't really aware of, because these are just habits that we've kind of inherited. And people of color have been telling us this for decades, generations, and continually white people as a whole, we've noticed as a committee, come to the table and are like, ooh, we're finally talking about racism. And BIPOC people are saying, are you kidding me? And so there needs to be this needs to be part of our shift, how we relate to each other, who our leaders are, how we're learning from each other. And it's going to take a little bit of different listening, especially, and part of this, and this is one other piece I wanted to name and give this back to Fran. We are an 88% white denomination. That if we need to make sure that we white people are beginning to pick up some of the work, that we ourselves are engaging leadership in the spaces that we can, but not in a paternalistic way, in a way that follows leaders of color without demanding their work. Or if we do demand their work, that we pay them fairly for it. Because, and this is part of what made our committee 2 years slow to get off the ground. The committee was supposed to be 75% people of color. And we said, well, there's so few people in the PCUSA who've given their lives to this work. And now we're giving them even more work. Where are the white people showing up in order to do this work? So it needs to be that kind of both and that we've kind of missed. So we're shifting the conversation and we're shifting that work. So Fran, back to you.
So that was a really good setup. So thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Co-Inspire conference at Montreat, because it was kind of a coming together for our committee, and it was a new kind of revelation in the work as we move forward. So I'm sure you've heard the word white allies. We throw that around a whole lot, and we want to call ourselves allies instead of waiting to do the work and having BIPOC people call us their allies. But we're trying to move beyond that as we talk about the church, and as we talk about the racism that exists within the church, and the ways that we've oppressed our siblings of color. And so we're starting to talk about being co-conspirators, breathing with our siblings of color, walking the path with them, so that racism within the church is not their problem that they have to bear, but it is the problem of white people who built the systems and the systems within the church, so that we are accountable to changing those systems and those systems of oppression that we've built in this country and in the church. And so we are working to be co-conspirators with our siblings of color. As we were doing our work and having these learnings, and we were, Jennifer Harvey was there. And I don't know if you know Jennifer Harvey, but she has, say her book, Ryan. Oh, he's looking.
Well, Dear White Christians.
Dear White Christians. Thank you.
It's about this. I'm going to put a link to the Erdman book in the comments.
Thank you. That always, the title always goes out of my head. But Jennifer Harvey was there, and we had opportunity, some of us, to gather with her And we were talking about the work we were doing because we're very excited about our work. We're very excited about the new relationships that we're building. We're very excited about the possibilities and the way God is working and moving in the church. And Jennifer said, well, you folks have done this like a million times. Why is this any different? So we sat down and had some conversation with her. That kind of informed our work from that point forward, in the ways that we're looking back into the denomination. There are oodles and oodles and oodles of reports that came to the floor of General Assembly, and we've affirmed and we clapped and we felt very happy with ourselves, especially as white people. But then the work and the suggestions and the demands actually of the reports, they kind of fell to the ground and we never followed through on those. So I'm going to pop it back to Ryan now.
Yeah, and this was probably, for me, one of the bigger kind of aha moments about our work around racism in the PCUSA. It's this, because our charge was to hear voices long silenced. And I believe that's even a direct quotation from the Confession of 1983, the Brief Confession, I believe. So this is who we are, and so it's our charge. It's what we're supposed to do. So I always imagined that the voices that were long silenced were somewhere out there. They never got a seat at the table. They weren't allowed to be members. They weren't allowed there. But we realized, and it slowly dawned on me, that the way that we silence in the PCUSA people of color is they do have a voice. We don't give them a voice. They have a voice. They've used that voice, and that voice has been heard and celebrated and nodded, and then promptly, as in like a week, forgotten. And so, if those of you may be familiar with I wrote a blog reflection on behalf of the special committee coming out of this General Assembly, and in that, I shared the last 10 years, I think, of anti-racism action that overwhelmingly was passed, either by a unanimous vote or huge, overwhelming majority. And I haven't heard personally of any of it since in my 10 years of being ordained, because we do it, we celebrate it, we clap it, we post it on Facebook, and then we drop it. And we have some people who really pour their hearts out into those reports and are quite bitter about how the PCUSA abandoned them. How it said, sessions, read this, mid-councils, look at this, and then nothing. That is one of the silencing tactics that we have used. Or we haven't really done that kind of structural work. Or we host a speaker, an event, something, or we do a book study in church, and then we check it off so we can move on to study discipleship or Advent or something else. And we think we cured racism for that season. And again, these problems and these patterns continue, which kind of feeds the some of the cynicism around the anti-racism work, and has created some problematic relationships and partnerships that we've had, why we're so disconnected. So yes, I see the question. Can I put the link to the log in the chat? I will be happy to do that. I have that on backup. Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So one of the things that, and this is where I wanted to move to too, because one of the things that Jennifer Harvey mentioned, she's the author of Dear White Christians, is one of the things that we are not hearing from our siblings of color who are Black, who are Indigenous, who've been telling us this for decades and generations even, is that we have an overemphasis on reconciliation, on racial reconciliation, at the expense of reparation and reparations. There, about 10 years ago, the PCUSA formed a task force to study reparations. I don't have that link for you. I can grab that another time, but you can look that up. And it's a beautiful statement about the theological approach on why reparations are valuable. Completely forgotten once it was overwhelmingly approved by the PCUSA. And here's where this is really important. If we imagine any other sphere besides race, if we imagine like an abusive kind of relationship, if we tell somebody who has been abused that, hey, let's do a public hug, hold hands, let's get out together in front of everyone and we'll show how united we are. Maybe we'll do a march down the street. Maybe we'll do a sign of reconciliation. If we saw that Thank you, Fran. There it is. If we saw that, we would say that's being really abusive, because the person didn't promise to make any kind of amends. They didn't promise they wouldn't do it again. They didn't show that they learned anything from it. Yet that's what we do with race. Is that we have these reconciliation events, these signs of solidarity, but the abuse continues. And because in white communities, it manifests the way that we won't hear the abuse. We're like, that happened in the past. When it's people of color saying, no, it's happening now. The effects are still happening now. And there's continue to be these divides. So this is one of the biggest things of our committee that we are really, really encouraging, is to look at whether we're looking at a lens of reconciliation or reparation, and how does that manifest, and how does that work? Back to you, Fran. I'm going to grab this link.
So we have come to the conclusion that there is not a way that we can recommend and work towards reconciliation in the church until we acknowledge ways that we want to make reparations. And the word reparations has become such a dirty word mostly to white folks, because to us, when we think about that word reparations, we're seeing dollar signs. It can mean dollar signs, and it should mean dollar signs, but those are not the only ways that we need to make reparations. So in the church, as you look at the dynamics across the denomination, you can see very clearly the ways that that oppression and racism has caused the Black community, the Black church within the PCUSA, not to thrive in ways that other churches have. Where their properties had to be built, and we didn't advocate for having those properties to be able to be built in places that where property values were going to maintain their value. Ways that we've separated, ways that we call our siblings of color to serve on committees. So we have that Black person or that Korean person on that committee without considering what their gifts are and what committees they should be on. And so again, just using them. And so we can't look in the church at reconciliation and as my grandmother used to say, y'all go on out and love one another. There are some things that we need to do to say to our siblings of color, we see the ways that we've oppressed you. We see the inequity that has been. We see the ways that you have been silenced or that we haven't listened to you. We see the ways that we have oppressed you and not cared for you in the way that Christ has called us to care and love one another. And these are the things that we are going to do to repair those relationships. I can pop it back to you, Ryan.
Yeah. Looking at a question here. Well, I need to read it. In your work, did you happen to have any conversations with staff or committee members of self-development of people? Yes. This was our church's response to the Black Manifesto of the early 1970s that sought reparations from denominations. We are one of the few churches that made a positive response. Yes, but kind of. Yes. George Foreman. Oh, this is a lot of reading. I'm sorry. Hey, everybody read this. This is some good stuff. This is a comment from John from 2nd Indianapolis. Yes, the Black Manifesto, for those of you who are familiar with that, you need to look at that. This is from 1970s. It was a very specific call to reparations that actually had some things that we could do in the white community. Jennifer Harvey's book speaks very clearly and specifically to the white church's response in general to this, and the call for reparations in the PCUSA did did go as far as create this new thing called self-development of people, which was a success. However, my understanding in speaking with some of those folks is that I think there is still some lingering sense that the PCUSA still has not done enough with reparations. And we did host a member who was a part of the writing of the document on reparations, and we had a webinar with that person who did speak, and that was an amazing. We did that right before the PCUSA Week of Action. Totally forgetting this person's name. Oh my gosh, I'm really sorry, but there is still some work to do, and there's still some work that we can do to help demystify reparations and to know, and this is kind of a sneak peek of coming attractions, that our committee response is probably going to have something in the form of making a shift to reparations. So we want to make sure that we name that and share that as well. So one of the things that I think for me too is that I think reparation. I mean, like we're talking about reparations, but we're also talking about an approach, a framework of reparation, of repair. And so I think it is interesting that, you know, as Fran mentioned, that the PCUSA, the white dominant culture here, does tend to think and see it mostly in terms of dollars, whereas, oh my gosh, how much is this going to cost and what's it going to look like? And whereas the people who've been harmed are looking at ways of fixing the relationship, you know, and their ways of healing the body of Christ. It's a different orientation. And so one of the ways that we can do is we can shift our attitudes and feelings around reparation and reparations, and then my hope is then the rest will follow. So I want to say, I'm going to look at the comment again. John, thank you for raising that history and raising the important work that they're doing. Because self-development of people is a wonderful, wonderful gift and work with our church, and a wonderful expression of our denomination, of our church. I still think that there are strong feelings that we could have done more and that we should do more, and that hopefully this is the work that's coming. Take a look at John's comment, by the way. That'll help you with some follow-up reading.
So I think, Ryan, you were talking about Mark Lomax and William Yu.
Mark Lomax, thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
so
and I think if you, we have a Facebook page, and I think it's recorded, and you can watch that discussion. It was a Zoom discussion, and I think it's there. They were very good discussions.
So overall, and then I'd love to shift into some time for more questions. But we need a timeout in the PCUSA. We need a self-reflection check on the way that we talk about race and the way that we've misinformed ourselves and conditioned ourselves and taught ourselves to talk and understand about race. One of the best starting points, and this was in 2016, Jan Edmiston and Denise Anderson recommended as moderators One Book, One Church, which was Debbie Irving's Waking Up White. And that is one of the most accessible on-ramps to this conversation that I've seen. I mean, Debbie herself, I had a chance to speak with her a couple times about her work. She is one of the sweetest people like in the world. And so she is the most accessible way to get into this conversation and to get people new in order to break down some of these misconceptions. And the best way to start, you know, is looking at or one of the best ways to start anyway, this isn't sequential, but is to understand our own story of race, understand what whiteness is, how whiteness functions, how it functions within our spaces, how it functions within our church, and how it functions in our country. And what that means. So there's historical arguments you can look at. That's where William Yu's presentation was so powerful, because he spoke to racism in the PCUSA since its history. And basically the way PCUSA has kind of fostered and compromised with racism as we've gone along to create the practices that we're trying to deconstruct today. So that's a kind of a peek of our work, you know, sneak peek kind of our work. I want to be aware of our time because Fran and I, we get excited and we can talk about this a lot. But I want to open it up for questions for you. I'd love to hear you express the question, but if you'd like to use the chat for that too, feel free to go ahead. Moderators might need your help seeing however it is you pick people. Questions? I see a question here from Mike. In a small church, almost 100% white with many who don't see the issues, where do we start? I have opinions about that. I absolutely have opinions about this. As a small church pastor who's been a part of many of these conversations, I'd love to speak into that. But I want to give Fran first shot at this one.
Well, so this is something we hear a lot. While you may, a lot of churches think, well, we just need to find some Black people and invite them to our church so that we won't be all white and we'll just have them come here. And that's really the wrong way to look at that dynamic. You have to start by working on yourself. One of the questions I always have people ask is, well, why would anyone want to come to this church? But why would any person of color want to come and be part of this? How many people of color do you know? So start with yourself instead of the congregation. If you don't know a lot of people of color, get to know people of color. And if you live in a community that's mostly white, one of the things that I did is, I have friends on Facebook, if you use Facebook or other kind of social media. And some of my friends had friends who were people of color. And I friended people of color, all kinds of different people of color. And I just watched their conversations and learned. And listened to the dynamics and listened to how excited they were about their faith in Christ and the way that works in the community, and how communities of color work out their faith in communal kind of ways. So my answer is probably a little different than Ryan's. I always start with ourselves. And if you're trying to look at how to make your church have more Black people and talk about Black people or people of color, I would say you need to start with yourself and see how many people of color you know, and how do you start working on yourself before you start working on your church. Back to you, Ryan.
Yeah, and this is the strength of Debbie Irving's book, Waking Up White. And even Shelley Touchluck's book, which is a little bit bigger and has a different perspective, Witnessing Whiteness is another way. It's an idea of kind of recognizing our own whiteness and then trying to find our way, because we've been indoctrinated to not see ourselves as white, which is part of the way racism functions. And so that's a wonderful and important starting point. And there's a wonderful metaphor that I've appreciated about what Fran said, that warning sign of if we could only get a Black person here into our church space. We need to, and this is where the historical question comes, which I see a question in there too in the comments. When Black people didn't just decide to make their own Black church. They left the white church, what is now the white predominant church, for their own safety. And Jamar Tisby's book is amazing on this, The Color of Compromise. It shows the history of how that has all kind of unfolded. I love the idea of looking at this phenomenon of like a canary kind of being in this coal mine. Is that they've left or they dropped from that space because of the toxicity in that space, right? So if we want to get these people coming in without fixing the toxicity in that room, those microaggressions, the side eyes, the dominant white saviorism and paternalism and some of these other attitudes that just come naturally because that's what we learned without, you know, deconstructing them, then we're just setting up some people to be hurt. So that's one thing, and I say that to back up Fran's point. In predominantly white spaces, the way I like to encourage people to think about it is I would interrogate the white space. Why is the space white? Okay, I live in Illinois. Fran lives in Michigan. I live in this beautiful, beautiful town that's quite wealthy. That we are 97, almost 98% white. And why is that? If we look at our history, we'll start to see words like sundown towns. We'll start to look at these things called racial terror lynchings. Now, I thought lynchings were just like you kidnapped a black person and then you hung them in the woods. That's not what a lynching was. A lynching was a public carnival activity right in the town square where they tortured a black person. Sometimes a random black person, oftentimes caused and sparked by an accusation of sexual misconduct against a white woman. Almost all of them always proved false. The one that sparked the Springfield riots in my presbytery was based on a lie, and that person died by suicide who created that lynching that killed those two people. Those racial terror lynchings were meant to shape the community for generations. They were designed to send a message to the black communities that they were not welcome or safe here. Tulsa, the Tulsa riot, same thing. So we are living in communities, okay, that we are enjoying, perhaps, quote unquote, the legacy of these racial terror lynchings and these sundown towns. The sundown towns were the phenomenon of a curfew against black people in your town. That violence will befall you if you are caught after dark in these towns. You can actually look on a map that what's his name created. Okay, mixing up my scholars right now, who actually created a running list. You can see if your town was a sundown town. You can see and log where the closest racial terror lynching was. We had 4 or 5 in my presbytery, and we had a number, about 8 or 9 different racial terror sundown towns in my presbytery. Those are the communities that are now asking, why are we all white? There's no racism here. When it was really, the truth is, I'm going to just say it, your ancestors, you've been living here a long time, created the conditions of the town that we're in, okay? But we have a very shy resistance to being able to acknowledge the sins of our countries. And I heard just recently on the news, someone mentioned that Eddie Gao Jr., I think, just said, the sins of our country are not unique, but where we are unique as a country is our inability to face and name the sins of our past. That's one thing that we're really bad at doing as Americans. So I would say we need to interrogate the space, and if so, we need to divest of some space. If you look at the way that wealth has shifted in our communities in the last generation, look at the policies that created and support the new policies that would shift the wealth back. And that's where we're getting political, but that's where the rubber meets the road. And I will say that BIPOC communities in general are vastly better at talking about politics and political matters than white people are. We say the word politics in our white spaces, and whoa, Pastor, you can't go there. When people of color are saying, can you please catch up with us? This is where the conversation needs to be.
So I see a question from Amanda about what are some good talking points and starting points when discussing the existence of structural racism, and how should we combat it with kids of all ages from 5 to 18. So one of the ways that you can talk about race is to start talking about our history. And you don't really even have to say you're focusing on race when you talk about it, but you can talk about some of the laws when you go back to the beginning of the way our country was built. Some of the laws that were put in place as we went along that were designed to separate out people of color from white people. And you can look at ways that our country was structured. that separates out and oppresses a people of color. So you can start to talk from the very beginning about the ways our systems were built for the convenience of white people and whiteness, and were designed to put us at the center of attention, and everyone else was on the margins. And so the country was built to serve whiteness. That's one of the ways to start talking with kids about those things without making it a boring history lesson. But if you look from the very beginning at some of the ways that our countries was built, Hamilton, some of the ways that laws were put in place to keep people out, who was out and who was in. What were we going to do now that we had this whole Chinese population, and how are we going to control them? What were we going to do about Native peoples, and how do we control them? So the doctrine of discovery. So there's a lot of ways to start talking about the structure, and then looking at the ways those different structures interact. Ryan, might you have something to say about that too?
Well, can I invite everybody to just, because I usually say this like midway through, but I'll do it now. Can I invite everybody to just take a big collective breath where you're at right now? Just a big breath. There's a lot we just talked about. The scope of this conversation can be really broad, and it can feel really wide. I like to encourage people to think of it this way. There's multiple ways of approaching this conversation. The first way is looking at tending the 6 feet of space that you have with you and around you. This pandemic has taught us a lot about the 6 feet of space around us, right? How important that space is, right? To make sure that we're responsible for that. That's a wonderful starting point for us, but it can't be the only starting point for us. Each of our communities, we have a stretch of road that represents 400 years of racism and policy and history that continues onward with today, with new racist policies that are continuing to happen. Just flip on the news. Give me 5 minutes, if that, depending on the channel, it'll be quicker. We can find some racist policies that are being advocated for. So on that huge road of 400 years of history, we can tend to the mile marker of our own road. What racism do you have in your own community that you need to tend to? It might look different. One of my churches did a drive to get body cams in their police department. Police department said, if you can get the community to raise $30,000, sure, we'll do it, we guess, good luck. And they did it. And the police department went, okay, I guess we're doing this and we're bearing the cost from here on out. And a church did that, okay, which is an amazing witness. Now, that might not be the same need in Philadelphia, okay? In Portland right now, it's trying to get their police budget to roll back about $7 million that increased over the last 4 or 5 years. And so that's their struggle and their fighting. So we need to tend to our own mile marker, but we also need to make sure that we're also looking, as Fran said, to our partners. We have people who are people of color in particular, who are doing the work, who don't need to be taught from us what a reconciliation march would look like. They don't need to be taught what would make us comfortable. They're looking for partners who can help and back them up on what they need. And this is where I want to go back to John's comment about the Black Manifesto, because there was a time where the Black leaders of our church said, this is what we need from you, reparations. This is how. Some people did it. Other people said, no, that's too much. So that's the other part of this, but there's a lot that we can do. And I do want to amplify Alice's recommendation here from Ibram X. Kendi's Stand from the Beginning. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I got mixed feelings about his follow-up, How to Be an Anti-Racist, but feel free to email me and we can talk about that. Or Fran too, feel free to talk with her about that. Stand from the Beginning is absolutely wonderful. Oh my gosh, I'm loving talking with you folks, but we're kind of running out of time and I want to honor your energy level for today. Fran, anything else, or do you want to give it to Alan for closing thoughts before we close?
Well, I was gonna follow up on real quickly on one thing that you said about standing beside folks who've been doing this work for a very long time. As white people, when we step up to help folks, we want to be careful that we don't take over. Sometimes we get very excited, and because we're white, and it's part of how whiteness works, we know the answer and we're going to fix it, and here we go. And we don't always think about the safety of the people who are around us, or their purpose in the process. We're looking at the ends instead of the means that are sometimes very important too. So our tendency is to jump in and take over, and we want to be very careful to work beside and follow in this work.
I want to give the space to your Presbytery leader. As Fran and I are Presbytery leaders, and we value the space for the Presbytery leader to add any comments about conversations about what you'd like to add, Alan, or what you'd like to note that you've observed, and then we'll close. We want to close with something.
Yeah, thank you, Fran and Ryan. It's been a very engaging conversation, and I suspect a lot more questions will arise, and I want folks in the Presbytery to know that there's been work going on behind the scenes to prepare for some of those conversations. We have a design team that has been at work for well over a year, and we hope to do a follow-up conversation with Ryan and Fran, hopefully before Christmas, if dates can be agreed upon. But then after the first of next year, we want to have a series of conversations about, somebody mentioned the steps, the cycles of how do we get from repentance to repair to reconciliation. And some of those are intentional conversations among people. One of the things I would challenge folks in our presbytery to follow up on some of what you laid the groundwork for is simply to get to know the history of any congregation in your local context that may be of a Black, an Indigenous, a peoples of color kind of congregation. For instance, if you knew that in Indianapolis, our Witherspoon Presbyterian Church is where it is now because it was pushed out of its home to make way for the interstate, you would understand some of their history and some of the ways that they had felt like they were, expendable in the process, that their faith heritage was not as important as everyone else. So I would just encourage you to start having conversations like Fran and Ryan both with this is a series of conversations, or difficult conversations that
I think you're breaking up a little bit, Alan. Is Alan breaking up?
Yes.
encourage us to continue this work. And
Thank you, Alan. I caught the value of that. You're going to be continuing this work ahead. I do want to say that one of the things that one of the patterns that we have fallen into that has hurt us is we do something like this and then we pat ourselves on the back for getting through it, and then we don't revisit it again. So we've been really intentional about making this explicit invitation for follow-up. Yes, we, as Alan mentioned, we'd love to come back to you in this space to continue this in some other way, to find some way to maybe even turn the heat up or take the conversation to another level, and especially on the structural level, which I'm so glad that your presbytery has committed to. I'm inspired, and I think that's really beautiful. So I want to end by inviting us to close by you kind of self-expressing where you're at. So I would like to use the chat comments. This might be a little tricky for you who are on the phone, but if we can, I want you to pick one of these three options that represents, and try to think of something, try to finish one of these sentences. I think, I feel, or I am. Pick one, and then use a word or a sentence or a phrase that best represents where you're at with this conversation right now, however that is. Just to give you a chance to kind of self-express how you are in this particular moment. And I'll read these as best as I can. I am learning. I am overwhelmed. I'm ready to continue the journey. I think we need to take visible action within the larger communities in which our churches are located. I realize how much I need to learn and adjust my thinking. Others, even if it's just one word. I feel good and informed. I am grateful for the inspiration you offer. Afraid to make a mistake. That's real. I'm all in. I am daunted but determined. I am inspired to improve myself and my community. I am tired of talk. That's real. I want to do something, not just talk about it. I'm in the middle. I am over whiteness. Oh, personal thank you for that one. Any others? I realize, like Mike, I have much to learn. I am ready to continue the journey. We are reading the book, Good White Racist, good. And we are starting the work of uncovering our history and our town. Wonderful. Keep those coming. This is a conversation that has that's to be continued. It's a conversation that has begun before us and will continue after us as we do this work. So feel free to continue to self-express to each other and to even practice talking about racism and talking about whiteness, especially in our midst. Even though acknowledging that some of us have more practice with that, depending on what our racial demographic is. I'll add that I am grateful for you and your work and your commitment. It inspires me that you're doing this intentionally. I'm grateful for you, and I'm grateful for the marathon that this is, as tiring as this can be. Fran, what's your I think, I feel, I am?
I am grateful to have new partners in this work.
Amen. Amen. May I close this in prayer? And then I'll hand it back to the moderator? Or, yeah, I can pray. Does that work, Fran? Everyone take one more deep breath as your lungs enable you to do so. Gracious, most amazing God, we are here in this moment. This is our time. You have called us to this specific time and this specific place with these specific partners. God, we ask that you bless each seed that you plant amongst us. Bless the journey that we have been on. Continue to challenge us, each of us, no matter what stage of the journey we're on, whether we're just beginning, whether we are exhausted, whether we need a break for a moment, or whether we are on a roll. Bless us in our work. Help us to work together. Help us to move for your justice, and help us to build a beloved community that is just and loving and is life-giving, where there is no more death, and where you may wipe every tear of every eye. May it be on earth as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.